Do you have those days when you just can't make sense at all of the world around us? When everything you look at feels so messed up, so wrong, that it feels as though there's no hope at all of fixing it. Well, on days like those, which for me is most days at the moment, I'm like a man in the desert looking for an oasis of drinkable water, but I'm looking for droplets of reality from other people, something to hold on to. So preoccupied as I am, for example, with the US presidential race, some of what jumped out at me recently was a conversation between broadcaster Tucker Carlson and his guest, a vanishingly rare example of a desperately endangered species, which is to say a proper old school journalist. And towards the end of the conversations, across 2 hours, towards the end, Carlson asked the journalist in question, Mark Halperin, who's a veteran of 3 decades at least at the beating heart of US politics. Tucker asked him what he thought would happen if Trump were to win in November. We'll have a look at this.
I think that will be require an enormous amount of access to mental health professionals. I think it'll lead to trauma in the workplace. I think there'll be some degree of
Are you being
protest. 100% serious. 100% serious. I think there'll be alcoholism. There'll be broken marriages.
What?
Yeah. They think he's the worst person possible to be president, and having won by the hand of Jim Comey and Fluke in 2016, and then performed in office for 4 years and denied who won the election last time, and January 6th.
I have watched that multiple times. I think it's absolutely profound. I mean, at the end of the day, it's one opinion from one journalist, albeit a journalist with decades of experience at the coalface of US politics. But let's allow for a moment that he's right. Imagine if something like half of the US population or the US electorate is poised to lose its mind in the event of an election result. The United States of America has been, well, surely we can agree, it's at least been held up as a beacon of Western democracy. It's the land of the free. What hope for the very concept of democracy itself, which is to say an idea predicated on the assumption that after a free vote, an electorate must accept the result, and everyone from all sides put their shoulders to the wheel to make the best of things, well, at least until the next election comes around. What hope for that idea if a sizable chunk of 350 million Americans has a nervous breakdown because their chosen candidate lost and someone they despise to that extent won the election? Halperin suggests also in the same conversation that Trump supporters would better handle a Harris win, that they could sort of take that on the chin in a way that Dems couldn't handle a Trump win, which is also interesting to say the least. And he said that he hoped that in that event of Kamala Harris winning, that the Democrats would be sensitive in victory, that they would manage it well. Well, I don't know. I don't see it. I would hope that it would be so. But surely if Mark Halperin is right about this latent psychosis, this great well of psychological trauma, the looming risk of mass breakdown, you'd have to at least countenance the presence of a risk that having won, that all of that mental instability would manifest instead in a Democrat appetite for the ultimate revenge on Trump and his supporters. Let's deal with this threat, this existential threat once and for all. So, I mean, is this where America is? And if it is, then that's a cause for concern for everyone in the West. It's a concern at least. If tens of millions of the citizens of that democracy, of all democracies, can't cope mentally with the result of a democratic election, where does that leave the rest of the West? And earlier in the same conversation, Mark Halperin talked about how his profession, being journalism, and by extension the media, had dealt with the truth, which is to say the truth that was an open secret as long ago as 2017, that Joe Biden was then, 2017, in an obvious state of cognitive decline, which is to say he was demonstrably suffering from some sort of dementia. Halpern said he could see it, he knew it. Tucker Carlson said he could see it and he knew it. And according to Halpern, most Americans, certainly those that were not necessarily drinking all the time from the trough of the mainstream media, knew that Biden was losing the plot as long ago as 2017. And yet, knowing that much, when Biden ran for and was made president of the United States of America, the leader of the free world, the man with his finger on the nuclear trigger, the reality of his mental state was covered up, swept under the carpet and covered up by the very professionals, journalists, state officials, whose duty it was to inform the American public. And then at the same time, Halpern suggests that most of the American public, or a lot of the American public, already knew anyway and chose to turn a blind eye to that reality. I mean, have a listen to what Mark Halpern said.
I think this is the worst scandal in journalism, American journalism history, because anyone knew what was happening. The public knew what was happening, and yet the cover-up continued. And when the cover-up was exploded,
the cover-up of Biden's condition,
a decline of cutie.
Again, I look at that over and over, and I almost don't know how to process what I'm listening to, although I find it eminently credible, eminently believable. What condition is the profession of journalism in? What condition are the institutions of the US government when all those who conspired and colluded to keep that kind of truth from the American public are able seamlessly and without a moment's reflection or soul-searching, far less meaningful any accountability, able to freely carry on as if nothing had happened. And there's no consequences for that. And no one even stands up and says that they can see that it's happening right before their eyes and that it shouldn't be. Journalists knew that Joe Biden was senile before he ran for president, and they covered it up, along with the anchors, the media execs, and that's before we get to the figures in government and civil servants who also covered it up until the last possible moment and said that this was the best version of Joe Biden we were ever going to be blessed with right now, that he's sharp as a tack. They were in lockstep with one another. And then they spun on a dime from one moment to the next to lament his decline, or simply to say that for the good of his legacy and for the good of the party and for the good of the country, it was time for dear Joe to go. And then in the aftermath of shameless, dishonest, egregious conspiracy to lie to the American people, consequences are there none. I just don't know where to go with that information, because that information is out there and not enough people, or not enough of the people that can make a difference with that information, seem to care. We've learned to call this Trump derangement syndrome, in which everything is only and always about Trump. It's all Trump's fault. All roads always lead to Trump. Now, Kamala Harris made one of her relatively rare mainstream media outings. Recently, she appeared on Fox News for a sit-down interview with Brett Baier. Watch this.
More than 70% of people tell the country is on the wrong track. They say the country is on the wrong track. If it's on the wrong track, that track follows 3.5 years of you being vice president and President Biden being president. That is what they're saying, 79% of them. Why are they saying that? If you're turning the page, you've been in office for 3.5 years.
And Donald Trump has been running for office.
But you've been the person holding the office.
Come on.
Madam
You
Vice
and I
President.
both know what I'm talking about. You and I both know what I'm talking about.
I actually don't. What are you?
Harris, if you notice, she even seeks in real time to inveigle Baier into sharing her Trump derangement syndrome. She wants him to be expressing his Trump derangement syndrome too. Come on, you and I both know what I'm talking about. But Brett Baier, Fox News, says, no, I don't. Tell me what you're talking about. Which leaves her to, well, she's actually got nowhere to go but to say it all again. Over the last decade, it's clear to me that Trump, is unfit to serve, that he's unstable, that he's dangerous. And that's just a pivot straight back to Joe Biden's line on Trump. Whenever she's in doubt, she just runs back to what Biden has previously said. And then Baier says, if he's as bad as you say, half the country's supporting him. How come? It's painful to watch. It's a moment. It's a monumentally disastrous performance, among many by Kamala Harris. I mean, it's a high bar to pick the worst, because fundamentally she demonstrates over and over again that she lacks the ability to answer questions live. I don't know how to process that either. This is a woman running to be President of the United States of America, and she can't or won't answer questions when they're put to her. So the search for reality and truth is taxing, but every once in a while there are glimpses of reality. I mean, they're not pleasant, but you think, oh, that actually makes sense. I can see that. When someone lays reality out where it can be seen. So all the while, a large part of the American electorate is allegedly on the point of mental collapse, possibly to be brought about en masse if Donald Trump's elected to a second term. And let's remember that in his first term in office, he mostly kept America out of war, and by some estimates, the economy did quite well. And so all the while the American left allegedly teeters on the edge of breakdown, the would-be Republican Vice President, Senator J.D. Vance, well, he offered the following.
Do you hear yourself? Only a handful of apartment complexes in America were taken over by Venezuelan gangs, and Donald Trump is the problem and not Kamala Harris's open border? Americans are so fed up with what's going on, and they have every right to be. And I really find this exchange, Martha, sort of interesting, because you seem to be more focused with nitpicking everything that Donald Trump has said, rather than acknowledging that apartment complexes in the United States of America are being taken over by violent gangs. I worry so much more about that problem than anything else here. We've got to get American communities in a safe space again.
It's, that, do you hear yourself, Martha? It's a good question from J.D. Vance, because it highlights something fundamental about the all-pervading nature of Trump derangement syndrome. That journalist, like Kamala Harris, continues to make everything about Trump, so that everything, whatever it is Trump's fault. Whatever the issue, the left's response, the mainstream media response, is not to talk about the issue, but to say, well, yeah, but Trump's not been in the White House since 2020, and yet he's still to blame, according to Kamala Harris. As Vance said, no one, not that journalist, not the mayor of the city, was denying that apartment blocks in a United States city had been taken over by violent Venezuelan gangs. But rather than caring about that and making the priority to move heaven and earth to fix that for the benighted citizens living like that, the number one talking point was what Trump had said about it. It's the same with Hurricane Helene. The preoccupation does not appear to be with moving heaven and earth to help those people affected. The reflex is to contemplate first whatever Trump is saying about the handling of the aftermath. He's not the person in charge. What should matter, what everyone should be talking about, is the lamentable, apparently incompetent response to help the people so affected by the hurricane. US politics are compelling, to me at least, but they're also frightening to me. And I ask once again, where is America? I don't mean on the map. Where is America spiritually, in terms of its sense of itself? And is it, wherever it is that where Americans want to be? that part of the US population that's so deranged by the thought of Donald Trump, well, they want a president in the form of Kamala Harris. Now, as I said, she hasn't been putting herself out and about much. She's not appearing in the way that Donald Trump is or J.D. Vance is. Not even in the aftermath of the hurricane, which caused such devastation and loss of life. Many commentators noticed she was missing in action, in the zone of devastation. So in that context, so deciding instead for another of her relatively rare outings, she appeared on a US podcast called Call Her Daddy.
Oh, you don't know who they are? Let me familiarise you with their work, and apologies in advance for the content here.
How do you work with the and the on a man?
The it really depends on the guy. Like some guys don't like it. Yeah. Some have and you can on them. Yeah. Put them all. Like some guys are like whenever you try to do it.
So Rita in Australia sets that up well. He gives a good sense there of a good example of the nature of the Call Her Daddy podcast. And having had that flavour, if that's the right word to use, of seeing the community Kamala says she wants to reach, if not by inference to belong to, here is Kamala herself with the host of Call Her Daddy, Alex Cooper.
I want to take a moment, and can we try to think of any law that gives the government the power to make a decision.
I know what you're going to ask.
About a man's body.
No.
Is there any law?
No.
Yeah, except the millions of men who've been drafted into war, forced to put their body on the line for their country. Did they forget about that?
So there's where Kamala Harris seeks to stand to give her call to action to the people of the United States of America. Now, without even having to speculate about the nature of the podcast and wondering why she would choose that when she's been so absent elsewhere. I mean, obviously, if she had been everywhere, if she had been appearing at the opening of a crisp packet, talking to anyone and everyone about anything and everything, then by appearing on that podcast, you might just be showing how broad-minded you are and how broad spectrum you are. But when you've been so very choosy about where to be seen and so absent from most of the platforms that people would expect to see her on, it's a very odd choice to make. But as I say, without any of that speculation, just think in that context what Kamala Harris was saying about legislation on bodily autonomy not affecting men's bodies. First of all, obviously, as Rita responded, what about the draft, which sends men's bodies to war, to be turned into pink mist, whether they want to go or not. But also, what about the unwanted medical intervention in a time of so-called pandemic? What about talk of mandated or all but mandated jabs with experimental gene therapies that were neither safe nor effective? Where was anybody's bodily autonomy in that context, male or female bodies? So that's America. But on this side of the Atlantic, the plight of democracy is similarly laid bare. And just to give just something that jumped out at me recently, that just I thought in that same way that J.D. Vance was able to say, are you hearing yourself? We're offered up anti-establishment funny men, apparently, and in this instance, watch this: the likes of uber-lovey Stephen Fry talking to Andrew Marr.
This is part of the problem in America, is the smugness of the so-called coastal metropolitan elites, what are called the flyover states. I don't know if you ever knew in New York, the Carnegie Deli, which was a fantastic old-style New York deli, it's sadly closed now. And you go and you get a corned beef sandwich or a Reuben sandwich, and you get this incredibly thin rye bread, and in between it, this astounding beef,
massive
this
meat,
massive pastrami or corned beef, huge amounts, more than you've ever seen before. And this, as I say, tiny bread. And America's like that, California and New York, these thin bits. And if you think you know the sandwich just from the thin rye bread, you're making a terrible mistake.
Yeah. As well as listening to the words and how evidently pleased Stephen Fry is with his analogy, it's the men's faces, to be quite honest. It's the expressions that are unconsciously there. So that how more establishment. These were people that were once at least portrayed as anti-establishment figures. How more establishment could two men sound than Andrew Marr and Stephen Fry there? Do they hear themselves specifically seeming to dismiss the mass of the US population as meat in a sandwich? Corned beef. Do they hear that? I'd say it's almost too distressing for words. But to get back to my original point about a world that's not making sense to me, here's the thing. If half of the American population is on the verge of a nervous breakdown, if half of Americans are actually on the point of being finally driven mad in a way that will be horrendous, apparently, and will take years of therapy, we might have to face the possibility that driving people mad is not an accidental consequence, but the desired effect. If half of Americans are mad, driven mad, then the state and the mainstream media and the oligarchs no longer have to worry about them. That job done, box ticked. Those people have been put exactly where they're supposed to be already. So if the world makes no sense, then might that be because the intention is for the world to make no sense? No matter what happens in November, the very last thing for anyone to contemplate is losing their mind. There's a bigger game in play here, and it's clear to anyone paying attention that this is the time for people to pull themselves together, and to pull together for the sake of their nations and their nation's sanity.